The Roosevelt Institute for today's event, Envisioning the Good Life, the Need for a Progressive Vision. My name is Hannah Grudge-Begley, and I'm the director of the think tank here at the Roosevelt Institute. Earlier this year, we published a report titled The Cultural Contradictions of Neoliberalism. In it, the authors argued that the right has been savvy in its ability to leverage mass culture to advance a vision of what society should look like and manufacturing consent for that vision. By contrast, the left has struggled sometimes to articulate a clear vision of the good life, focusing more narrowly on the nuances of policy design and implementation. But if the left hopes to beat the authoritarian right, a task that feels more important than ever, it must, the authors argued, ground its politics and policies in a progressive vision of the good life. But what should that vision look like? In June, the Roosevelt Institute, in collaboration with the American Prospect, published an essay collection that sought to grapple with this very question. And now, today, we come together to continue thinking about this question with some of the contributors of that collection and the co-authors of the Roosevelt Institute report that inspired it. We have a great group of panelists that I'm very excited to hear from today. But first, I'd like to introduce you all to Dayen, who will be sharing some remarks to get us kicked off. Dayen is a journalist and author and the executive editor of the American Prospect. David, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thanks to Roosevelt for having me today. It was really our pleasure at the Prospect to partner with Roosevelt on this project that gets to the heart of what Paul Wellstone once said should be what politics is all about: improving people's lives. I came to progressive media from film and television, mostly nonfiction, documentary, a little bit of reality. And I was an editor. My job was to assemble footage together from tip to tail to tell a story. Sometimes the producer would give me a precise roadmap of exactly what they wanted to put on screen. And sometimes I would get a box of tapes and be told, find the story. And so I would pour through the material and see what I could come up with. Telling a story that people can engage with is really no different, whether it's moving images or print, whether it's for entertainment or news, whether it's to inform an audience or to persuade them to your way of thinking. You need a beginning, middle, and end. You have to connect with people intellectually and also emotionally to make an impact. You have to make sure people understand the story, can follow along, and can recognize why it matters. So I took those skills from television and film production into journalism, where I really also feel like a storyteller. The building blocks of what I use now are not establishing exteriors and reverse shots, but facts and figures and source quotes. But the goal is the same: get your audience invested in the stakes of the story and lead them to a payoff. Often in my journalism, that means giving people a picture of what the world can look like with better policy. We didn't have to throw people out of their homes after the global financial crisis. We could have worked with them to maintain community. We didn't have to allow young people to exit college with the equivalent of a mortgage, a lead weight on their financial outlook. We could instead see paying off their student loans as an investment in the future and the stability of the next generation. We didn't have to continue the cycle of outsourcing and industrial decay that it abandons large sections of the country. We could use federal incentives to rebuild our towns and factories and give people something to believe in again. We didn't have to abandon young people to the unforgiving world of social media. We could invite them to find meaning in the moment and each other. I see my journalism and the work we do at the American Prospect as a tool. The stories we tell can be picked up by advocates and activists and even ordinary people in their efforts to create a just and mutually beneficial society. Filling in that picture and making it real takes a different kind of storytelling. While it's certainly central to my work to explain the inner details of how power works in Washington and the corporate boardroom, there's no reason for advocacy to stop at an earnings report or an appropriations bill. You have the power to articulate what living in a progressive world can look like, with pride on the job, communities that solve problems together, and maybe, as we'll talk about, swimming pools. You can envision a society where people find strength in one another and aren't just consumer widgets that accumulate X amount of cheap goods and place Y amount of leftover dollars into meager retirement accounts. The stories we tell are what motivate people to welcome a better world than what we have and motivate policymakers to get us there. This whirlwind of a moment that we're in the middle of right now has become a contest of two competing visions. There's a dark vision of fearful world of crime and border invasion from which people must be saved, and a brighter vision of economic opportunity and rebuilding and the freedom to pursue your goals. This has become something of a binary choice, and it really comes down to a core question: what kind of country do we want to live in? Everyone here today has a duty to ask that same question. What kind of country do we want to live in? And then we need to sketch out what that country looks like, what it feels like, how people feel living in it, and how that moves us closer to our best ideals. So once again, thank you for having me. It was great collaborating on this project, and I'm excited to hear the panel discussion that's coming up next. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for getting our conversation started today. I now want to introduce our moderator for today's panel discussion, Shahrzad Shams. Shahrzad is the Senior Program Manager of the Race and Democracy Program here at Roosevelt and co-author of the Cultural Contradictions of Neoliberalism report. Shahrzad, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks, David, for your remarks. And thanks, of course, to the American Prospect for providing a home for the essay collection on progressive visions of the good life. I'm super excited to be moderating our discussion today, and I'll just start by introducing our lovely panelists. So first, we have Deepak Bhargava, who's a longtime community organizer and movement leader, and was formerly a senior fellow here at the Roosevelt Institute. Deepak was a co-author of the Cultural Contradictions report, which he wrote prior to becoming president of the JPB Foundation earlier this year. And then next, we have Harry Hamberry. Harry is a documentary filmmaker, a journalist, and a former high school history teacher. And Harry was also a co-author of the Cultural Contradictions report. Next, we're joined by Johanna Bozuwa, who is a climate policy expert and activist, and who is the executive director of the Climate and Community Project. Johanna wrote an awesome piece for our Good Life essay collection in the American Prospect, where she made the case for low carbon leisure as a way to not only combat the climate crisis, but also the crisis of community and connection wrought by neoliberalism. And then last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Daniel Martinez-Hosang, who is a fellow here at the Roosevelt Institute and a professor of American Studies at Yale University. Dan, along with his co-author, Colina Seesanker, also wrote a great piece for our Good Life essay collection, where they explored how efforts made by organizations like Connecticut for All's democracy schools can be used and act as a multifaceted solution to the neoliberal crisis. So before we dive into our discussion, just a quick housekeeping note. Folks in the audience should feel free to put their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen at any point, but I'll be sure to save us some time at the end to get to those questions. But for now, let's get into our panel discussion. So each of you have, of course, thought about and written on this topic of a progressive vision of the good life. And so I want to start our discussion off with a baseline question to situate the rest of our conversation today. And the question is, why is it important that we ground our political and policy decisions in a progressive vision of the good life? Like, understandably so, many people are anxious or even pessimistic about the current climate, and there are a lot of immediate term concerns that demand our attention in the here and now. And so I'm wondering how you respond to the argument that we can't really be like affording to daydream about like a utopian world when the present one is like quite literally burning around us. And Harry, maybe we can start with you on this one.
Sure. Thank you, Shirzad. It's great to be here, and thank you to Dayen for kicking us off. I think the impulse that animated the report was the sense that we cannot cede this territory to the right, we progressives, we on the left, that the question of how to live a good life, how to get a good life, the question of happiness is one of the most profound questions of human existence. And it's something people naturally ask, and it's basically a political question, although it's often framed as just one of individual thriving well-being. And it's one that is one on contested ground, one that actually the right has done quite a good job of answering for people, providing answers for people for quite some time. And this report actually let me do a kind of a deep dive on happiness studies and the rise of positive psychology. And the real story is fascinating. I think a lot of progressives, many people on the left, kind of avoid talking about these topics because they think that they are inevitably corrupted. That talk about happiness sounds very self-helpy, and self-help is very individualistic. And if you look at the actual history, it's really fascinating because happiness studies really originated in the 50s and 60s, motivated by a desire to create international comparisons. And we know from these international comparisons today that like the happiest countries are ones with strong social safety nets, strong sense of community, strong social trust, and a lot of the Nordic countries, but others as well. And in the late 90s, though, a right-wing billionaire named John Templeton, who was friends with Norman Vincent Peale, who was one of Trump's major mentors, who officiated at both of Donald Trump's weddings. John Templeton bankrolled the creation of positive psychology. And it's kind of an unprecedented moment because never before in our history, I think, has there been a very wealthy individual who sort of on his own kind of created an academic discipline. And it's true that that discipline has a pretty strong neoliberal bias. But it's been really interesting in recent years to see people jumping in and contesting it. And if you go back to the earliest days, like Alfred Adler and Abraham Maslow and John Bowlby, these were men of the left, actually. And a lot of the early impulses were not right wing in studying happiness. So, but what's happened is to a great degree, the discourse around happiness and well-being and the good life has been dominated by a very individualist perspective that boils down to a kind of victim blaming. Like if you're not happy, it's because you are not thinking right, and you can change your own mind all by yourself, regardless of whether you're poor, whether you're a victim of discrimination, whatever. And the vexing thing is that the right has capitalized on that. So we saw in 2016, the unhappiest counties, the counties reporting lowest levels of subjective well-being, were the ones with the strongest support for Donald Trump. Anyway, so I think that this basic impulse is that we need to engage on this terrain. If we simply have a political rhetoric that offers people, more stuff, and have a kind of transactional economistic model of politics, it's going to do us a lot of damage because right now the right is extremely active in creating cultural on-ramps for people, and I think we'll be talking about those in a bit. So that's what I'd offer to start things going.
Other panelists, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I'd say one compelling reason to do this is that what we have been doing hasn't been working too well. So the more technocratic, policy-centered, economistic way of doing politics, which is prevalent in many parts of the progressive movement, has not been compelling or convincing to people. And it's not won hearts and minds. And the contrast with an authoritarian movement that really doesn't start with policies. The policies are downstream from a substantive vision of how society should be organized and how we're supposed to relate to each other. The power of that, I think we often neglect. Now, I obviously disagree with the content of it. It's a patriarchal vision. It's a tribal vision. Feels like a throwback vision. But it promises certain things about order, about security, about kind of knowing how you fit in a social order, community of a kind, an exclusive community. That has real emotional resonance. And so then a policy like building a border wall or something, it's a pretty weak tea as a policy, but as a symbol that speaks to that moral order of how we live our lives together, it becomes a very powerful one and a very galvanizing one. And if you think about this in the realm of the intellectuals like Patrick Deneen and others who have kind of articulated this vision, or politicians in other countries like Viktor Orban in Hungary, it has real legs. And so as I see it, the business of articulating how we should live together as human beings, what is the purpose of our lives, is the ultimate ground of politics. And so to cede it is really to lose the whole war.
I totally agree. Totally agree. Johanna, were you gonna chime in? Go for it.
Yeah, I was going to chime in because I think Deepak set me up very well, thinking about, that border wall. And as someone who works on the climate crisis, of course, what we are going to see is more migration, both internal to the United States and external, right? And so with the climate crisis, what we're seeing is like people having to react not only to isolation and long working hours and all of these things bred by our economic system. You're seeing the breakdown of our ecological system as well. And so what that can draw people toward is, if you're trying to survive a wildfire right now, there's a wildfire in Oregon that's 420 square miles of a blaze, and that is very disorienting. And people are having to move and shift places, and that really can create this very dystopic future, this very dystopic focus that actually breeds, and the right has been able to actually take some of this and say, that's why we need a border wall. That's why, eco-fascism is something that is actually very much happening in some of these Western states in particular, where we have wildfires. And so it's really incumbent upon us as progressives to counteract that, that reality, that anxiety that's associated with these, overlapping polycrisis. And, if we're looking at a recent study by Lancet in 10 different countries showed that young people see the future as frightening. And so half of them say that climate change is negatively impacting their lives. So if that is the truth, how do we build political power? How do we build power? It's that we have to put something forward in this changing context that actually defines that good life and what they could be looking for, that is going to, instead of, as Deepak was saying, build these insular communities, it's actually reaching out and building resilience in communities overall. So, I think that one of the ways to do that is to actually talk about what your life will look like and how it will be different. And that's why at Climate Community Project, one of our favorite check-in or meeting someone for the first time questions is what is your Green New Deal for leisure? What is the thing that if you think about the future, what is it going to look like? And sometimes, folks say, I just imagine being able to walk into a museum for free and feel cool and be with my family. Whereas others are I just want to go to a baseball game, my rec baseball game. And those things are create these types of social ties that then allow us to push back against some of these things border walls and insular forms of community.
Fascinating. Johanna, I want to stick with you for a sec. And I want to ask about kind of like the role that government should play when it comes to the good life. Should government play a role in articulating what it means to live well, or should the focus of government really be more on delivering the vision? Like, what do you think about that? And then
Yeah.
let's feel free to get in as well.
Definitely. So I think it has to be a cycle of reinforcement in my mind. If we think about how we got some of the things that we do consider the good life, like having a weekend, that was a bottom-up organizing that was done by unions that, fought for that piece of infrastructure that now is embedded in our, in our systems and in like regulation and, workers' rights. And so I think that speaks to kind of this balance and this, push and pull that we can create between policy and culture. And actually, my colleague, Daniel Donna-Cohen, did a great piece that was called Seize the Hamptons. And he looked at the Popular Front in France in 1936, which had that actually was working for that 40-hour work week, and then also wanted paid vacation, wanted discount on train fares, and like basically was this like fight for the working class to have leisure. And he talks about, the Blum, the person who was like in charge and the leader of this movement, how that summer that they had won all of those things, all of a sudden, all of these, like the French working class went to the ocean for the first time. And so like they brought their bikes onto this, like the pieces of public infrastructure, right? Onto the trains that they could now afford to get to what is theirs, which is like, what is our collective space, like oceans, like beaches. So I think like that's a really great example of, bottom up organizing, creating the container in which government can hold. And on the other side of this, I think David said something about pools. Of course, I focused on pools for part of my paper. I feel very strongly about pools. I'm sure most people who live in New York and DC and on the East Coast feel very strongly about pools right now. But if you think about that, again, that's a piece of public infrastructure that, in the New Deal, it was a part of the culture making of the New Deal was investing in pools and public parks. They built 750 public pools during the New Deal, and they branded them as such. They showed like this is part of the infrastructure we are building for the people. And those things have staying power. And right now, what we've seen is that like a combination of extremely racist histories of segregation and white flight has meant that we've seen the disassembling of those pools and not enough people. And then neoliberalism has meant that we don't have the people to actually, be lifeguards at that pool so that people can have access to it in these high heat days where they might not have AC in their own homes. And this is the only place that they can go. But if we actually made decisions from a policy perspective to invest in those pools, then people can go to those pools, meet their neighbors, have a feeling of interdependence and solidarity that then creates this positive reinforcement that allows them to say, oh my gosh, wait, that's what climate policy is? That's so exciting. I actually want to fight for climate policy moving forward. So I think it can have this really positive reinforcement if we're building the relationship between culture, community, and government.
Yeah, and Dan, you kind of got into this a little bit with your essay too, with democracy schools.
Yeah, I wanted to thanks and just so much for everyone to bring us together and to pick up on something on Johanna's wonderful essay. There is something, and I'll just talk in a moment about some of the right-wing conferences I've been going to for my own research and how they're so attentive to so many of the themes that are in this report. One of the ways they do that is to think about public institutions broadly and where there is the deepest sense of public ambivalence, failure, some sense that something was promised and taken away, and trying to then exploit that. You see what that stands in for? You've given your trust to someone. They didn't really care about you. They were there to take advantage of you. That's why you can't trust, and that sense of no one can be trusted. You only have yourself. And we can't count on that. And so to think about what Johanna said is then means we can't just advocate, do lobbying, deliver a public program, and imagine the work is done, because there's an ongoing, very active force that's really actively trying to discredit everything, right? So how do I, your essay made me think about like marvelous free concerts, like in both like places like New York, right, and in parks, but also in small towns as well, that are, they really meet the definition of a public good. They're open to everyone. They're not provided on a competitive basis. But thinking about that, if they're saying, you see government failing, you see it failing, we also have to be able to say, look at this, amazing thing that we're able to do together, I want to just say something quickly about these conferences. I went with a research team. There's a far right kind of student focused organization, Turning Point USA, that many of you will have heard about, Charlie Kirk. They run this huge conference every December in Phoenix called America Fest. And I went with a team. And I think, as not someone who identifies as a conservative on the right, our sense is these must be austere, hateful, stiff places where no one is having a good time. And when we went, we were worried, how are we gonna like fit in and conform ourselves? It was the opposite. It was a huge, huge party. Photo booths, music, stickers, connections all the time. You could feel it. And they could care less that people from outside were in. They were like, come on in, any questions? We're here for you. Even in the political organizing workshops, again and again and again. Make it fun, make it fun, make it connect to people. There is nothing there about Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, tax policy. That's an earlier Michael J. Fox version of conservatism. That's not what's happening here. And so when I first read the report, I said, they're doing this much better. And the team I went with said, we have nothing equivalent like this, where you go in and just feel connected. And so many of the people I talked to said, when I say, what brought you here? It's just that. I feel lonely at my school. I feel lonely at work. I just there. And there's nothing on promise to really deal with that. It's all the austere authoritarian measures you can imagine. Get married, have kids young, recognize it's a Christian nation, et cetera. The Pantheon, Steve Bannon, all those folks there. But I was startled at their ability to merge that kind of sense of euphoric joy and connection with this deeply authoritarian vision. I'll just say on our end, it's not just about here's the components of a good life. Like, we can't turn this into another policy thing and say, here's a 10-point program for the good life. You'll get this, you'll get that, you'll get that. Then it's just another deliverable. It's clearly something people have to experience. I think, Johanna, this is what you're saying, right? Experience it. And so the essay I wrote about was about this really wonderful statewide group. It's a coalition, Connecticut for All, that sponsors democracy schools. And some of these, there's union members, community-based organizations, immigrant rights groups. Some of it is helping to unpack this like Byzantine tax system we have in the state that continually fails to underfund all these necessary public goods. But so much of it is just getting people to talk to one another, getting Uber drivers and teachers and childcare workers to kind of giving them spaces to connect. What are you seeing? How do you make sense of this? I work in a higher ed institution. We are as cordoned off and segregated as ever, even from one another. So our solutions have to be deeply aware of the partitioning that's a part of neoliberalism and how we take steps to break that down so people get an experience of what those connections that social movements can offer that often no other spaces can. Not even your best show on Netflix, whatever you like to, consume, as pleasurable as that can often be. That's always what people say about your best experience in a union, neighborhood organization. It gave me something there that I couldn't get anywhere else. That's why I keep coming back, not just because I read the 15-point legislative platform and it gave me chills. And that's what we need to think about as we're doing this.
I love that. Well, you were like, we can't get into like point by point platforms. My next question was going to be, what are some of the essential elements of the good life? So Deepak, maybe I can pitch that to you, understanding that this isn't what we're running on as in our politics exactly with that policy platform, but I'm just curious to know, like, are there kind of things that you could say are maybe universal that all people really want at the end of the day, that all people envision as part of their best life?
Yeah, so I think this is such an important conversation, and I think the elements are actually in the two pieces that Danny and his co-author and Johanna did. And I just want to like tease out, they're such wonderful pieces. This piece on democracy schools really illustrates our need as human beings to understand the world and to do it in community with each other. And, you know, I came out of this experience for the last few years teaching CUNY students who are largely working class adults at night. And like the level of hunger people have to make meaning together of what the heck is happening in this world, their passion for doing it in community together. There's the solidarity aspect, just the hanging out with each other aspect that came out on that piece that Danny and his co-author wrote, I think are so important. So, and the sense of agency that I'm not just like this passive recipient, that I actually can remake the world around me in a different way. So I think that's one really important strand. The other important strand, which there's actually a lot of left history and progressive history on, but it's been attenuated in recent years, comes out in Johanna's piece so clearly, is like play and pleasure and fun. So this idea of low carbon leisure was very inspiring to me. And I think if you were to ask about the contemporary progressive movement, are we fun and joyful? I don't know how many people would raise their hands and say, that's our defining characteristic. But actually, when people do join groups, community organizations, et cetera, we often have this mental model that they're joining in order to get something out of it. And I think more often they're joining because they want to be part of something. It's really, as political scientist Hari Han says, it's belonging before belief. And in fact, people often join things where they disagree with the positions of the group that they're joining because they feel cared for, they feel seen, they feel recognized. So I think a lot of those universals are there. And the other thing I'd say on this topic is I think we need to be unafraid to have a point of view about human nature, which is a little bit of a controversial thing to say in progressive circles, I think. And what I mean by that is that we are wired in certain ways, and we're learning more and more about that and what that wiring is from neuroscience and other things. There's wide diversity across cultures and so forth, which we can acknowledge, but there are some universals. Those universals are actually taught in a number of faith traditions. Some of those universals live in subcultures, in queer subcultures, in Black culture. They're not the dominant culture. And I think we can excavate from all those places, from science, from subcultures, from social movements, from different faith traditions, some of those things. And there are things like community, belonging, recognition, care, getting care, giving care. Connection to Earth is a super important one, and to our kind of environment around us. And then these aspects of individual expression are part of our nature, done in and through and with community, which has aspects of play and fun. So we are these kind of meaning-making creatures fundamentally. And if you start from this premise, then we can come back to ask, well, how do our social institutions of family, of work, of society, of education, how do these things facilitate those human longings, and how do they not suit those human longings? So, you know, that's not an exact description of all the qualities, but I think those are some potential moral sources that we can draw upon to begin to construct that alternative vision. And I actually think a lot of those came out in really vivid and powerful ways in the papers, including these two especially, that were in the collection.
Thanks, Deepak. In a moment, I want to turn to some audience Q&A. So folks, continue putting your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, please. But in the meantime, if anyone had any other thoughts on our panel, Harry, go for it.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to riff on some of what's been said, one of the most robust findings in the science of happiness that is often lifted up by the more progressive and left members of that field who are speaking up more now, is the importance of connection in our lives. And that is something that neoliberalism has undermined in all sorts of ways through this culture of, rise and grind, the overworked American, the different ways that it atomizes us and isolates us. And now the right is swooping in and taking advantage of that in all sorts of ways with these online on-ramps to QAnon and the crazy, toxic men's movement. Deepak mentioned how people put belonging before belief. And one of the studies that Hari Han cites actually found that nearly half of the people who enter the anti-abortion movement were not against abortion at the first event they attended. It's a really profound fact. I highly recommend a documentary called Battleground. There are two documentaries called Battleground. One is about the pro-choice and anti-abortion movement, and the contrast is quite striking, because you see these young women who were swooped up by their sorority sisters and ended up in Washington, D.C. at this giant conference, and they're just there to have fun. And something we point to in the report, Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, talked about collective effervescence, and later anthropologists have talked about the importance of rites of passage and this liminal phase of communitas, and which is basically a state of equality and joy, but sometimes translated as collective joy. And the power of that experience in identity formation cannot be underestimated. And it's something that progressives in the left have failed to appreciate. We think that we can win people over with arguments and with policy platforms. And what we really need to be doing is extending a hand, not retreating into comfortable sectarian bubbles, but building a bigger we to resist the authoritarian right.
Can I just to add
Please go for it.
two wonderful things to Harry's wonderful comments. One is that sense of not just being able to tolerate kind of difference within our coalitions and formations, but seeing it as necessary, energizing, something that's not a sign of like a limitation or a fetter, but something we would naturally expect. And I actually think, I'll just say, they're practicing that, even though, to your point, they absolutely have a North Star and a vision of where they're getting people to. They have no problem inviting people in as you're kind of thinking through things. And I often find that's at odds with experiences and progressive formations. The second is that they are actually very, very attentive to very specific ambivalences and unevenness that people, especially young people, are feeling. So just one example, in the kind of mental health crisis that's becoming more, people are having more attention to across schools, universities, et cetera. And then the role of professional kind of advice, psychiatry, medication, a kind of certain like medical industrial complex that people do feel uneven about. You want to be able to access services, have them be affordable, culture relevant on the one hand. And on the other hand, that's not what delivers the good life, is just, it can be part of it. And they're attentive to that. They'll say, look, what do they tell you? Go to school, take this, do that, and get back to work. So it's not even like they're recognizing, and they're asking, well, why are we eating all these food additives? Why aren't we thinking about our organic farmer, right? Local products. And many times when I'm listening to these spaces, they sound like people that would have otherwise absolutely belonged, on those origins. So it's not just the kind of out there things that people are drawn to. If we don't speak to those questions now, they actually have solutions to them, and they're not afraid to use those issues to bring people in.
I think that's but both of what you have said really resonates with me. And I'm just thinking about, I am a millennial woman who is on Instagram, and it's incredible to see even the influencers that end up as a very progressive person on my feed, right? So if I think of, there are two particular influencers I'm thinking about. One is Ballerina Farm, and the second is Nara Smith. These are both young women who basically are, lots of people see their lives that look very slow. They make sourdough bread. They're making food for their family. And I think it's like this feeling of like, as a woman, I have kids, I have a job, I can't, like, I feel isolated. All of this is happening. And there has been this experience that people, I think that the right is tapping into, is like being able to slow down, that like the left is not creating that alternative to. And so people are seeing this and saying, yes, oh my gosh, if only I had the time to make Cocoa Puffs from scratch. But what that's doing is it's creating the entryway for this radicalization and, like, you know, the entrance in Nara Smith's case, like into the Mormon church, for instance. And Ballerina Farm, all of this also obfuscates like the reality that this is not actually what these women's lives look like either. Ballerina Farm, she's, you know, shows herself as a farmer. She comes from a billionaire's family with JetBlue, right? Like that's not, we can't achieve those goals that the right is saying are right in front of us if only we fall in line with the patriarchy and, you know, make bread for our husbands. And I think in contrast to that, I mean, my own radicalization story, like becoming a progressive, was looking for community, coming out of college, being a do-gooder, trying to find a way to get activated. And I found a like local climate organizing group that first I went to the meetings, that turned into potlucks, that turned into like weekends of organizing and fighting and like putting our bodies on the front line to get arrested, that created these like deep bonds that now, like in one case, like ultimately was, now I am married to one of those people that I met there. It's like, those are the types of relationships we have to be building and facilitating and bringing people into, because the alternative is the Ballerina Farm, right? And like not ever actually being able to achieve the goal or the thing that we are seeing in front of ourselves or in front of our phones.
Totally. The trad life appeal is there, sans patriarchy and white supremacy, right? Okay, so I'm gonna take a look at the Q&A here. We've got several questions that kind of get to this issue of balancing individualism with community, common good. So one question, for example, is how do the panelists grapple with the challenge to articulate a vision of the good life, both culturally and politically, that also requires individuals and communities to give something up? So kind of like combating this culture of individualism, consumerism. How do we balance that? I can pick on someone. Deepak.
Well, I was going to say, actually, in some ways, Shahrzad is the lead author of the Cultural Contradictions Report. You should speak to it, but did this deep dive into figures like Jordan Peterson and their appeal. And one thing I was struck, and I didn't watch as many hours as she did of all this stuff on, but one thing that really struck me about it was, there's something about entering people's pain at the point at which they experience it that's just very powerful. So like, make your damn bed. This seems like a very simple thing, right? But this kind of injunction that Peterson starts with of just take responsibility for your life. You are an agent. You can do things. It goes into a very kind of dystopic patriarchal vision about who men should be. But I think one question I have for how we do our politics as progressives is, most people are in fact grappling day to day with the individual realities of how to manage their own sense of well-being, their sense of agency and purpose. And I don't think we can surrender that and say it's all about the systems and the structures, that we actually have to bring some of that in. And I think the best of our organizing does, in some of the ways that's been spoken to on the call, where people's pain is recognized and seen and metabolized in the group. And there is actually a call for individual responsibility that happens all the time in good progressive organizing. People are asked to step up and speak at a city council meeting, or go get arrested, or go on a march, or whatever it is. But that impulse to like individual problem solve, I think we can't view it as like this liability we have to overcome. that people have to focus only on these kind of grand systems, that we have to meet people in the texture of everyday life. And so that to me is a kind of cultural reorientation that, and this is the boom that we talk about in the paper of self-help and wellness and so forth, that offers, in some cases, helpful, in some cases, not helpful, solutions of a kind. They're not the grand solutions, but they are attractive. They're offer this kind of gravitational pull because they're practical and they meet people in that place. So I think we need to take it super seriously.
Just if I could just add one thing there, I think sometimes I do work with K-12 teachers, whose jobs, like many jobs, are just transforming before our eyes. It's no longer about the subject, and whatever you learn in teacher ed, you're at the kind of forefront of all of these transformations happening in the lives of young people. And just two quick things. One is, when we're together, it's often not, here's a better way to teach X, Y, or Z. It's, what are you seeing? What do you notice? What's happening there? Like, people, if you just have to experience that on your own, it's overwhelming and it just keeps weighing you down. If you can think through it, as Deepak said, with others, it helps. But to the point about you made about, well, what are people doing in the face of that? How are they navigating? What solutions are they coming up to try to make a better life for themselves in the midst of this? And just one quick example of a group of teachers from a school in New Haven who, like, their lunch is their only time they get to, like, exhale for a second and breathe. And they just figured out how to, like, start doing potlucks to cook for one another so that the time could be a time of connection, versus another teacher who was on her own, had to actually run out every lunch to McDonald's. And she said when she came in one day and they asked her for the usual, she thought, like, what's my life become that, this is where I'm at. And so I know it's not just about, like, potlucks for all, but it is some attention to how people are, what are they doing? How are they figuring out how to make connections? And where is it that they're vulnerable and they have possibility? And I think that's true in every kind of job and facet as well. People are not just waiting for other people to tell them how to fix their problems.
Thank you both. Another question here. How do you think identity politics and this sort of tendency on the left to sometimes infight, tear each other down, can kind of fits into all of this?
I'll just maybe just start to say, on the one hand, I think we want to say that this idea of, like, universalist, colorblind, kind of reducing everyone to one shared condition was never attentive to the many forces shaping people's lives. And it's not just, like, to be seen as queer, a person of color, as person who's multilingual, et cetera. It's that you're navigating very different social conditions often, and we have to be responsive to that. On the other hand, I think there has been a certain kind of turn in which we've taken some neoliberal ideas and fused them with those politics, imagining that there's a kind of scarcity out there and a competition. So if I don't articulate and frame this experience, it'll come, there's limited time for resources and recognition. And so I have to kind of double down and to defend some site because that's my only possibility. That's clearly in reaction to something if you don't do that. And that gets us in these very dangerous places where questions of solidarity and coalition and mutuality are viewed as, like, a luxury. Well, I can't do that because in these times I have to focus on this issue and that's my obligation. And of course, we know there's many, many other examples, women of color feminism, queer color, kind of life and sociality, in which it's actually flipped over. I don't get to realize what I need and how to address that unless I can make those connections in other places. But I think that's been another kind of consequence of neoliberal logic, has been is kind of fading in some ways in our own experiences.
Daniel, thank you so much for bringing that up. And it just reminds me of my colleague, Olufemi Taiwo, and his recent book, Elite Capture, that, like, really articulates this and has been so useful in my own kind of evolution and thinking. And, like, when it comes to some of this, the infighting that's described, like, in some ways it is neoliberalism and, like, elitism capturing our interdependence and like the differences that we are actually like trying to build that unity around, and then re-putting us in these spots so that we can't build that collective power. And I just think that's like so important in terms of also like treating political differences as political differences and being able to like have those conversations, which actually means that we are talking to people and treating them as their whole selves, right? Like instead of like only deferring, let's say, to, you know, a Black leader, you're saying, okay, what are the politics that are involved? How are we coming at this from different angles? How, you know, how do we engage? And I think that that helps us get through some of the this discussion about about these types of like politics that are going on. So, you know, just a huge shout out to Femi and the work that he's been doing in that realm.
I so love those comments. And maybe just one small thing to add on this is, you know, I think identities can be portals to connection, or they can be, you know, kind of turn into walls and moats. And the best of the liberation traditions, the freedom traditions in this country have been this incredible generosity from people who were arguably the most oppressed. And I think of the Black freedom tradition in particular as super grounded in the experience of oppression and welcoming other people in as allies, as colleagues, and as people to be part of the struggle. Or I think of queer politics as at its best as inviting everybody to reimagine their relationship to gender and sexuality, and in a way that I think has done such a good thing for our civilization on those questions. And so there is this kind of generous impulse that's deeply grounded in a specificity that like opens out with this big heart. And that's the piece I think we need to nourish and grow.
You know, something that we talked about a lot in our report is the role of mass culture in kind of getting us to where we need to be. And one person put in the chat here, I find it amazing how many more dystopian novels about gender equity / feminist futures exist than visionary ones. I feel like sci-fi and literature offer us such an important opportunity to imagine how things could get better. I would love to see intentional investments into that kind of work, movies and TV too. So where do you think that we're seeing cultural projects that help us kind of get to this good life that progressives want, that can represent it? We have at least one millennial on the call. Yeah, come on.
I do appreciate that. And I think like one thing on like science fiction is that it was like, it was a right-wing strategy to actually take over and co-opt science fiction for a long time, and to actually use it as a visioning tool of like neoliberalism, of the patriarchy, all of these different things. And so I think that's actually very true. Like we need more pieces of like science fiction that allow us to play those things out. And in particular, I'm thinking of a book called The Dispossessed, who, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the incredible sci-fi author's name. She just recently passed.
Ursula Le Guin.
Thank you, Ursula Le Guin. Oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed by myself. But Ursula Le Guin and The Dispossessed, where she really takes like two different kind of concepts of what our society can be and like pulls them to the kind of like their outer limits, and then like figures out like what are the pieces of beauty here, what are the pieces that like even in our utopic world we're going to have to work through. And I think like that is such a great example of the type of like utopic thinking that we can do that you know, can help us think in new ways about things. So I know that I have actually used The Dispossessed as a way to give it to my friends that may have not, you know, thought a lot about like their politics and how they relate. And it's been one of those books that's really opened people up to new possibilities. So just a huge shout out to that. And to Ursula Le Guin, who is maybe not a new author, but definitely one that I deeply respect and admire.
So we have a number of questions in the chat about the current political moment, and we are a C3, so can't get into a lot of specificity here maybe, but I do think there's been a shift in energy recently, and maybe it's kind of an open-ended question, not a fully formulated one, but just how are we feeling about this shift in energy? Does it excite us? It's exciting me personally. Would just love to have you guys riff on that a little bit, and then we'll wrap up in a couple minutes here.
I mean, I think just to build on all of this question of like what kinds of experiences and connections and those possibilities will open versus a kind of new product, a new, stand-in for something in a more kind of consumerist way. We like this and not that. So, and I think there is this question, I'll just say it, when it comes to just electoral organizing in general, that is a part of political work that is often really a grind. Some people, and there have long been ways to make work like that fun, to make it connection, to make it thing like, I didn't want to spend 3 hours, on my weekend, but I got into all these really wonderful conversations. I think the real critique of it, and this has just been true for a long time, has been it just happens before elections when one kind of thing is at stake. And then, you can often have these wonderful conversations and they don't go anywhere. And so that's clearly a piece to figure out as well, which is how do we think of these as opportunities to do all the things that are being described here, including, just to add to the kind of culture point, we just lost the wonderful civil rights organizer and artist, Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was always attentive. That's the heart of all of that freedom work, and thinking about the anniversary of Freedom Summer as well. So, right, what does it mean not just to throw up precincts and doors and how the app works when people go out there, but ensuring that people get to do sometimes singing and eating and connecting together, and that just like someone is responsible for getting the clipboards back, someone is also responsible for ensuring that everyone comes out feeling like this is something I couldn't have done anywhere else, and when's the next one I want to come back? Because if that's not happening, it really doesn't matter kind of who's at the top of any ticket.
Agree with all that. The way of approaching it is, to me, like politics is the business of mobilizing energy. It's not the business of winning arguments. And, we write in the paper about, and a number of people have written about the Trump rallies as these kind of carnivalesque things. And they may seem, when you see clips on TV, that they're dour and negative and so forth, but actually the participants are having great fun. And so to me, the lesson of it is to train ourselves in the craft and the arts of moving people's energy, which is done by moving people's bodies, by sound and the power of singing. It happens when we march. It's like a very embodied practice, and it's one that happens together in groups. It often involves ritual. And I think a lot of this is implicit to us when we think about what social movements do and how they move the energies in people. Bernice Johnson Reagan being like a paradigmatic example of someone who was like the master at mobilizing people's deepest energies. So to me, that is part of the question of progressive social change in this next era, is how to put that mobilizing of energies at the center of what we do, rather than seeing it as, oh, maybe we got to do something around the edges of what we were already going to do, but it is actually the business of politics and social changes is moving people's hearts.
I love it. And I think that's the perfect place to wrap up for today. Thank you all so much. And thanks again to David for your keynote remarks. I really enjoyed this panel discussion, found it super thought-provoking and really timely. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. The Roosevelt Institute is proud to regularly host conversations on important topics like this one. So please stay tuned for future events, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. In the meantime, please take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.